Okay. Culturally Curious is Jane's organization, a nonprofit called Culturally Curious. His mission is to engage, educate, and unify groups through facilitated art experiences that inspire joy and foster critical and creative thinking, as well as appreciation for our shared humanity. And you can visit, you can see all of her programs and all of her activities at culturallycurious.com. So tonight, Jane O'Neill will present Art on Tuesdays, the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, a medieval fantasy. And this program will provide an introduction to the Pre-Raphaelites of the 19th century and look at the paintings of the leading members, including William Holman Hunt, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, and John William Waterhouse. Learn about the roots of this British movement and see how the artist's fascination with the medieval past, Romanticism, and realism led to a beautiful style that lasted more than half a century. I am very excited for this program, and thank you so much, Jane, for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me, Jess, and thank you everybody for joining us tonight. We're in for a treat because, as Jess said, these are really beautiful images, and maybe you've been attracted to them in the past because they are sort of objectively beautiful. But I've always found that I've been sort of intimidated by the complex stories and the symbolism and understanding all of the detail. And so tonight we'll sort of wade through all of that, and hopefully you can get a better understanding and appreciation for these incredible images and this very unusual movement in the art world. So we're just going to dive right in. We'll be talking about this image on the screen a little bit later on, so don't think that I'm just skipping over it, but we'll dive right in. And I'll give you a sense in terms of how we'll spend the next hour together. First, we're going to meet a few of these pre-Raphaelites. There were 7 original members and then dozens and dozens more. So I'm not going to go deep into anyone's biography. We're really going to be focusing on the art tonight, but I just wanted to give you a sense in terms of how things started. And then I should have used like better medieval terms for all of these categories. It should be more like, hark, how do you spot a pre-Raphaelite painting or something like that. So we'll just be talking about the general characteristics. And then I broke up some of these paintings into different categories: religious, historical, literary, and legendary. So that's how we'll kind of get some sort of sense and organization to what we're looking at tonight. And then there's a real fascinating legacy to these works. So you got to hold on to the end, because I think the Pre-Raphaelites have touched our lives, all of our lives, in really interesting ways. And the image on the screen here, because this is a slide that's really about how do we share our time together, this is Father Time, and the name of the picture is called Time the Physician. So going back to that idea of time healing all wounds, he is dressing a wound on the head of this soldier who has his laurel wreath down here, as well as his sword. So it's a little preview of things to come. The artist in this case is a female artist named Eleanor Brickdale. And if you're anything like me, you might fall in love with her over the course of the evening. All right, so let's get familiar with our original 7 Pre-Raphaelite artists. So what is Pre-Raphaelitism and how did it get started? It started with these 7 young men. It's sort of a boys' club to get started with, for sure. And the 3 men at the top are really the leaders here. It's William Holman Hunt over here on the left, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, and John Everett Millais. The sort of secondary layer here is a painter named James Collinson, who ends up leaving the group pretty quickly because of religious differences. This is an artist named Thomas Woolner. He was the only sculptor of the group. There aren't a lot of great examples of his work out there. This is Dante Gabriel Rossetti's brother, whose name was William Michael. Believe it or not, this dreamy dude right here in the middle ends up aging very poorly and ends up looking like this fella down here within the space of a few years. And then the last member is sort of the non-artistic member of the group. His name is Frederick George Stevens. So we're not going to see much by these gentlemen, but we will see a lot by the sort of top tier and generations generations, literally, that came after them. So just to get us oriented, like, who are these young men? How did this movement come about? They were really young when they came up with this. They were like 20-year-olds, and they were art students to boot. It was 1845. All of Europe, well, much of Europe is in like the state of unrest. There's revolutions popping up around the continent. And these young men are creative and artistically inclined, and they're thinking of sort of, striking out on their own. And I think when you're 20 years old, part of striking out on your own and part of like forming a sort of a united front is rebelling against something. And so in this case, they were rebelling against the founder of their art school, a man by the name of Sir Joshua Reynolds, who was not even alive by 1848. So this is a self-portrait by Sir Joshua Reynolds, who was alive in the 1700s. And this is the kind of work that Sir Joshua Reynolds created, sort of grand manner portraiture. So these young pre-Raphaelite artists, they referred to Sir Joshua as Sir Sloshua, and they really rebelled against essentially everything that he represented with his artwork. They didn't like how things were sort of dashed off, sort of loosely modeled on the structure, the organization that you would see since the Renaissance and past. So when we say pre-Raphaelite, we'll dive into what that means in just a moment. Let me give you a sort of side by side in terms of grand manner portraiture versus what the pre-Raphaelite artists were doing. Here we can see there's a fair amount of detail here, but on the right with the pre-Raphaelite image, there is an emphasis on realism and capturing and conveying as much detail as possible. Look at the way the landscape has been described by Sir Joshua Reynolds, and then look over here at how every single leaf and fern in the background has been detailed. Look at the details of, the folds in the dress, the curls in her hair. There's a real weddedness to capturing what is observable, but we'll see too that that they tend to romanticize this notion of realism too. So getting back to this term pre-Raphaelite, I think it's sort of an intimidating term in and of itself. What does it really mean? Did they hate Raphael, the Renaissance artist? No. Essentially, so this is an example of Raphael's work over here on the right. And Raphael loosely dates to around the year 1500. So this is a revolutionary art group that's looking back at what came before them hundreds of years, and they're rebelling against Raphael of all things. But they didn't hate Raphael, but they hated how this sort of became shorthand for what made a great painting. And Raphael created beautiful paintings, but they were in some ways sort of formulaic, create like a pyramidal composition. The most important element is right there in the center. There's an interest in the natural world, but not to the degree that that the pre-Raphaelites really were focused on. So over here on the left, I have an example of a work of art that came from Botticelli, an artist who was really prolific before Raphael, only by a few decades. But Botticelli's painting from the 1870s or 1880s, this is called Primavera, or springtime essentially. And first off, you'll probably notice there's a lot of different flowers in this picture. I think botanists have actually studied this picture and were able to identify like dozens of different flowers and plants that were in this picture. That's something that the pre-Raphaelite artists would have loved. In addition to that, even though we know that this is a picture about springtime, there's a lot about it that's still very mysterious to art historians. We can sort of safely identify a lot of these figures, but how they all relate to each other, all of that sort of remains mysterious. And I think there was an appreciation for that amongst these young pre-Raphaelite artists. So one of the pictures that I wanted to share with you, this is by, again, that female Pre-Raphaelite artist, Eleanor Brickdale, when she decides to paint kind of a historical imagined scene of an artist meeting his muse, she decides on Botticelli. So here is Botticelli, the young artist, with an example of his work back here on an easel. And it's actually the very prominent Florentine family, the Medicis, that are bringing in this woman named Simonetta Vespucci. And she was like the most renowned, the most beautiful young woman of the age. And so it's like this moment of electricity between the artist and his muse happening here. And of course, the Pre-Raphaelite artist who created this, appreciates Botticelli as an artist who came before Raphael, but is also giving us all this wonderful detail about what she imagined Botticelli's studio to look like, from the casework over here to the paints in the little jars, the fruit on over here near the windowsill. There's just really wonderful things happening here. And I think this interest between artist and muse is a good segue to just talking about the role of women in the Pre-Raphaelite art movement in general, because it wasn't just a boys' club. Even though we've got our 7 original founders there that were all male, women contributed to this movement in really significant ways. And so we're looking at 3 works here that are related to this one woman named Elizabeth Siddall. And she was like the Pre-Raphaelite supermodel. So over here, we see what was essentially a wedding portrait for her, of her, between her and that leader of the Pre-Raphaelite movement, Dante Gabriel Rossetti. So she married him. She was an artist in her own right. This is her at her easel, and the sketch was made by her husband. And then this is an example of her work. So we'll see a few more examples of works by female artists as well. But it's interesting to think that for many of these paintings, the emphasis is on women as subjects, as objects. And we'll think a little bit about how they actually contributed to the making of these works as well. So the Pre-Raphaelite movement was very short-lived. Very short-lived. It only lasted a few years, really. And then a few years beyond that, you had artists like Edward Burne-Jones, who we see over here on the left, and William Morris on the right, who were actually studying theology. And they got in touch with Dante Gabriel Rossetti, and they said, can you teach us a little bit more about what you were doing with Pre-Raphaelitism? And then the next wave was born, and they kind of adopted the same style, but maybe had a slightly different philosophy around along the way. And then you just had, like I said, dozens and dozens of artists who were working in the same vein, but not really connected to each other in the same way that that original group of 7 were. So it had some staying power. We're going to be looking at works that were made well into the 20th century tonight, but the emphasis will be on as many early works as possible. So let's talk about, how would you spot a Pre-Raphaelite painting? Well, there are a couple of characteristics, and I'm sure by the end of tonight, you'll be able to spot one from 1,000 pieces. So let's get started first thinking about color. We're looking at this gorgeous image by the artist John Everett Millais, who we were just looking at. This was created in 1851. And so this is a really early example. And the color here, if you're anything like me, your eyes go straight to this incredible blue velvet dress that this character is wearing, this woman is wearing. I say character because her name is Mariana. This is a reference to a Shakespeare play and also a poem that was written about the play. We won't go deep into that for our purposes for this slide, thinking about color, but look at the way the color sort of grabs you in this picture. And these artists were really intentional about using these very vivid colors, these rich, saturated, jewel-like colors. Even the reds in these stained glass windows here, the reds and the blues were actually intended to recall the colors that would come through a Gothic or medieval stained glass window. Here's an example of one from about 1100. So the use of these colors was Well, it had many purposes. It's like recalling medieval imagery in some ways, but it was also a good way for these young artists to get noticed in an exhibition. Think if you're, walking through a really crowded exhibition hall and there's some pictures that just jump out at you because the colors are so vivid, your eye goes right to them and your body will probably follow. So it was these artists doing their own publicity in some cases. So this next image here, which I just kind of always takes my breath away when I see it. This is William Holman Hunt's painting from 1849. So another really early painting. Now, before I tell you the name of this picture, I want you to just like register in your head what you think this picture is about, where your eye goes when you look at this picture. You might be surprised to learn that the name of the picture is called The Haunted Manor. And you probably, if you're anything like me, you didn't even see it first off because it's way back here. The artist Hunt is really focusing our eye, directing our eyes, like laser focus down on all of these different aspects of nature that he's captured here. So he's almost dominated the entire canvas with it, and your eye can't help but focus on like individual blades of grass and how the water is spilling over what almost seems like a little man-made waterfall here. And the building in the back seems like an afterthought, and believe it or not, it was. He added it in later. So this attention to the natural world, this keen observation of the natural world, is a big part of the philosophy. Truth to nature is something that these artists were always talking about. So you get this kind of like the accuracy of a botanist when you're looking at these images. And these artists painted outside on plein air before the Impressionist artists made it cool. So, and that was, just by about 10 years or so. So another aspect of this attention to nature, this adoration of nature, is a real interest in flowers. We're going to see a lot of flowers tonight, and they are gorgeous. This is John William Waterhouse's painting called Gather Ye Rosebuds While Ye May. There's going to be a lot of references to poetry tonight that might remind you of Dead Poets Society. So this is for a painting from 1909. And the title here is the reference to the 17th century poem by Herrick that says, "Gather ye rosebuds while ye may, old time is still a-flying, and this same flower that smiles today, tomorrow will be dying." So the emphasis here is not just on all of these lovely women who are picking flowers. It's the symbolism of these flowers themselves. So let's kind of zoom in and get a little appreciation of them too. These flowers and the flowers in virtually all of these Pre-Raphaelite paintings had symbolic meaning. In this case, these pink roses symbolized grace and elegance and sort of first love. When we think of roses, we think of passion, depending on how red they are. So if you get like red roses, it's like somebody's madly in love with you. If you get white roses, it's like, oh, nice to meet you. It's still pretty formal. So during this era in British life, there were flower dictionaries being published that would essentially guide people in what all of these flowers meant. And we think of, British culture as being very sort of buttoned up and prim and proper, but one way to convey your feelings for someone was to send them flowers. And let's be honest, for the most part, most flowers mean some kind of affection. But as we'll go through the program tonight, we'll see that in some cases, combining them or a particular flower has a very specific meaning that kind of heightens these pictures. And I think there's some appreciation to that once you know what they symbolize. I think a good way to think of this is like emojis today, or like using text slang today. Like if you wrote LOL in a painting that you made today, would people 150 years from now know what LOL meant? So that's how these flowers operate. They're subtle coded messages that we are going to decode together. All right, so we've got flowers, we've got nature, we've got color. We also have beautiful women, and a lot of them. So beautiful women are like front and center in Pre-Raphaelite paintings. This is a picture by Dante Gabriel Rossetti. This is his Lady Lilith from 1866. And she is very striking, isn't she? Now, I just talked about flowers, so you're probably dying to know, what do the flowers here represent? Offhand, I can tell you, Lady Lilith, she's a dangerous woman, basically. If you're familiar with her story, her biblical story, she was sort of like the first love of Adam, and she didn't cut it because essentially she's too dangerous. So we have white roses in the background, which again sort of suggest kind of the coldness of her affection, and then also a poppy in the foreground. And we can always remember what poppies symbolize. If you go back to your Wizard of Oz, poppies will make her sleep. Poppies are about sleep and death. So that's a lot of danger in Lady Lilith's picture. So when we're thinking about women, that's really the point of this slide. When we're thinking about women in Pre-Raphaelite paintings, I want you to understand them as a mix of realism, romanticism, and idealization, really. They are drawn from real life models and muses, but essentially, they are symbols of vice and virtue. They are almost always sexualized creatures, but some of them are good and some of them are bad. And this is, in this case, most certainly a dangerous woman. Here is a fairly rare depiction of a contemporary woman, a woman who's contemporary to the artists themselves. This is a picture by William Holman Hunt, and it's called The Awakening Conscience from 1853. And this is a picture of essentially like a loose woman who was having an affair with a married man. Here they are sort of like canoodling together. You'll notice that she's not wearing a wedding ring. And in this moment, she is rising up from his lap, and she's looking out a window that is where we would be. So there's a mirror in the back of the room that's reflecting the window that she's looking out of. This is a motif that we'll see a lot of. And you can see there's a garden out there. So at this very moment, she's having her spiritual awakening that, like, I shouldn't be like a plaything to men, because this is like not the right life for a good girl. So what you'll notice is that all of these pictures are kind of reflections of contemporary anxieties about women's role in life, in motherhood, in love. All of these things are sort of filtered out through these medieval stories, but in this case, in a contemporary story. So let's talk a little bit about medievalism too. We've got a lot of damsels in distress when it comes to the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, and even just the name, the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, sort of is like a reference to like the Knights of the Round Table, in King Arthur. There's a lot of that interest in legend, filtered through some of the great poets of the early 19th century in Britain. So we're looking at two works that seem to be medieval in theme. Over here on the left, we have a painting by John Everett Millais, The Knight Errant from 1870. And over on the right is a very popular painting, one of the most popular paintings from Ireland, Frederick William Burton's painting called Meeting in the Turret Stairs from 1864. What always amazes me about this painting on the right is that it's a watercolor. I can't like imagine summoning these very vivid colors with what, and the detail with a watercolor. It's gorgeous. But both of these pictures are about sort of meek women, strong men. Over here, the Knight Errant, we can see that this woman, this kind of statuesque woman, has been tied to a tree. Her clothes have been taken off. It's the middle of the night. Look up here, we see the little crescent moon. There's a knight who's coming to save her. And we see that he's already taken down one figure here. We can only see his torso. I don't know if he's been cut in half or not, but there is blood on this blade, and there's people fleeing up above too. So he's here to save her. The original the original composition for this work was that she was looking at him. It was like this moment of connection, but it was just too impure and like too sensual for audiences of the day. So it was repainted so that she was looking demurely away, as is our heroine over here. This is a story about a woman who essentially fell in love with her bodyguard, and she's doing the right thing, trying to slip past him, but he, can't contain his passions as they, brush past each other on the turret steps. So incredible, sort of beautiful imagery, but certainly sort of a myopic way of seeing women's roles, and sometimes women are even seen as villains, particularly for their beauty. This is a painting by the artist John William Waterhouse called "The Beautiful Lady Without Pity" from 1893. And I can't tell you how many of these pre-Raphaelite painters painted this same theme. This is a story that appealed to so many of them. And it's essentially a story about a really beautiful woman who lures in a knight with her beauty and then leaves him for dead. So this is about the danger of a woman's sexuality, essentially. And so there's all sorts of scenes of seduction like this, and we could probably spend some time too talking about the flowers in this picture, but we're just going to move on for the sake of time. I wanted to end this section of about spotting pre-Raphaelite paintings, just to give you a couple of examples of these later pre-Raphaelite images, again, by this female artist from the 20th century named Eleanor Brickdale. She's obviously not as wedded to some of those founding organizing ideas as a lot of the male artists that we'll see tonight. And so her later pictures, I think, just have this kind of joyfulness to them. This is a picture, I love the title, let me make sure I get this right. It's called "Chivalry Dying of Love for the Goddesses." I love how these knights are just falling all over themselves because they just can't even stand how much they love these goddesses in the background. And she also created another image that's called "The Challenge." This is the fight between love and death. So we have a very confident young boy representing love over here, and then this knight in dark armor on this giant war horse, who's sort of flanked by like a Grim Reaper type figure and a skeletal figure over here challenging him. So so these later images certainly rely on medieval imagery, but they're not as sort of steeped in these artists like wrestling with the role of women that was happening in the middle of the 1800s. All right, so let's dive into these four categories that we're going to be looking at tonight. Medieval fantasies as seen through religious paintings. And I want to emphasize that most of the artists that we're looking at tonight tended towards atheism, if anything. They weren't religious in and of themselves, but right around 1850, they understood that if they wanted to create an image that appealed to the masses, that spoke to the masses, that was easily understood by the masses, why not use the storytelling of religion? And we see that in this really amazing painting by the artist John Everett Millais. This is from 1850. This is like one of the first exhibited works by the Pre-Raphaelite painters. This is called "Christ in the House of His Parents." And believe it or not, like there was an uproar over this. And you're probably thinking, what on earth is medieval about this, Jane? Why is this in your medieval fantasies picture? I saw it several times before I sort of saw the connection. So what Millais was doing with this picture is that he is trying to sort of make the Holy Family look very real. He used a grocer as a model over here for Joseph. So look at like these skinny but like sort of muscular, sinewy arms that he has. And he used his sister-in-law to model for Mary. And so it was actually Charles Dickens who went crazy over this. I have to read you what he wrote when he saw this when he saw this picture. He said that Mary was horrible in her ugliness, And according to Dickens, Millet made the Holy Family look like alcoholics, slum dwellers, who were adopting contorted and absurd medieval poses. Medieval poses. That's an interesting thing that that a contemporary audience picked up on. So it's like haha over like how 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 outraged the contemporary audience was when they looked at this. But let's just remind ourselves that in 1850, people expected images of the Holy Family to be idealized, like Raphael's painting, but instead we have images of people in these strange poses that were more like something like you'd see from Van der Weyden, people who came before Raphael. Notice how we have these kneeling figures, these sort of hunched figures over here in this triptych. So this is like one sort of loose connection with religion and medievalism. In this next image, you might be able to see it a little bit more clearly. This is William Holman Hunt's The Light of the World, and this is from 1854. So we've got two versions of it. This is the earlier version over here. This picture has actually traveled the world. It's been called one of the most traveled paintings of all time. It's been doing its work sort of proselytizing because this is a very strong message. What we're seeing here is Jesus with a little light, this little lantern that he's holding looks so Gothic to me. And he is sort of a light himself. Over here, it's the halo. Over here, it sort of looks like the moon maybe. But he's knocking on a door that's covered with like weeds and vines. There's no handle on it. So he is knocking on like your soul. And he can't open up your heart, your mind, but it's up to you to open the door and be receptive to the message. So all of that is well and good, but let's take a moment to appreciate what Jesus is wearing in this picture. This is in no way historically accurate, let alone the fact that Jesus looks like a white man, but he is essentially wearing like a blinged out bishop's robe from medieval times in these pictures. So it's interesting that in order to convey this message, again, a religious message, a Pre-raphaelite artist is leaning on medieval costumes, at least in this picture. And of course, you know, the real attention to the nature and all of these, you know, vines and the plant life in the foreground here. This next image is like classic Pre-Raphaelite. It's fantastic. There's great storytelling here, and it's a little bit complex, but it really pays off in the end. So we're looking at a knight who has come to like almost like a little prayer temple here, where there was a crucifix of Jesus on display. And he has taken off his gauntlets to pray with his bare hands here. And we know who this knight is supposed to be. It's somebody from medieval times, essentially. And we know his story is that he had been passing along essentially with his gang, and he saw his main rival in this alleyway. And his rival had killed his brother. And this knight that we're looking at here decided not to do anything. And this is him coming to pray after the fact, sort of ruminating on the fact that he saw someone who had done something so horrible to him, but he kind of chose this path of peace. So let's kind of zoom in here too and see the look on his face and just this incredible sadness. I love the juxtaposition of Jesus's hands with the wounds of the cross here and the hands that are posed in prayer. I think this is such a remarkable image. And then you go back, there's flowers everywhere, of course. And as I understand it, these flowers down here were meant to symbolized grief, essentially. And why I'm sort of spacing on what those actual flowers are. They are, it'll get to me, it'll come back to me, I'm sorry. So all of these things sort of tie together to tell a really powerful story about that night. And this medieval story. So our next religious figure here is Saint Cecilia, and this was painted by John William Waterhouse from 1895. So a much later picture, and there's a lot about this that is like references to the classical world when Saint Cecilia would have been alive. Saint Cecilia is the patron saint of music. So So in this case, Waterhouse was really interested in this particular saint because there was a Tennyson poem from the 19th century that described her. So he's sort of using Tennyson and Tennyson's poetry to sort of summon, to conjure a visual image of Saint Cecilia that is kind of flirting with medievalism. So we see Saint Cecilia wearing kind of medieval garb over here, but in a classical setting. This is like classical statuary, like a throne over here. And then look at what's in her lap. This is like a classic medieval illuminated manuscript, and then she's kind of flanked by these angels who are playing music for her while she dozes. So the section from Tennyson's poem here is in a clear-walled city on the sea, near gilded organ pipes, her hair wound with white roses, slept Saint Cecily, and an angel looked at her. So he's taking a little artistic liberties by adding another angel. But now you're probably noticing all of the different flowers that are in this scene as well. So a story from classical antiquity provided the opportunity to infuse a little bit of medievalism in it. Now, just a few more images from this religious section, and this is one where I am kind of forcing it, but I've always just loved this picture. I always love to see how male artists interpret the story of the Annunciation, of the angel Gabriel telling Mary that she's the virgin, that she's divinely pregnant. And so in this case, you're thinking, what's medieval about this picture? And it's a pretty loose connection, but in this case, we've got Mary wearing this kind of loose fitting gown, which is not really medieval, but the sleeves here are what are a design that's called angel wing sleeves. And they're sort of emphasized because Mary is holding her head and her heart as she receives this news, trying to like reconcile, the intellectual revelation here and what this means for her soul, essentially. So of course, we've got all of these, all of the details of the flowers in this painting as well, which certainly makes it a classic Pre-Raphaelite painting. But even just the infusion of the fashion kind of connects it back to medieval interests in this case. And then one last image that sort of relates to religious iconography is this incredible painting, one of my favorites, by an artist named Ford Madox Brown, and it's called The Last of England from 1855. So this is another kind of rare example of a contemporary subject by a Pre-Raphaelite painting. But in this case, it is almost entirely inspired by the Holy Family, the flight of the Holy Family even. So this is a family that's emigrating away from England. You can see the white cliffs of Dover behind them. Even the circular format here is oftentimes used in religious painting from the Renaissance. And we've got this family sort of clinging to each other. Husband and wife are holding hands. And then you notice that the woman is holding the hand of the infant inside her shawl as they're just kind of buffeted by the wind and the raindrops as they set sail across the ocean. It's a really powerful image. I love the intensity of their gazes. So there's a lot here from these Pre-Raphaelite artists that ties right into religion. And we're going to turn our attention now to paintings that deal with historical figures and see how Pre-Raphaelite artists adopted specific figures from history that helped them dive into medieval dress, medieval fashion in their own particular way. So that new favorite artist of mine, Eleanor Brookdale, she did a golden book on famous women from 1919. And this is one of the many illustrations from that text. We'll see a few more tonight. They sort of stand out because they have this same sort of faded quality to them. But the famous woman that we're looking at here is Heloise and her famous romance with Abelard. So they're set in medieval times. They were 12th century figures that kind of fell in love with each other by writing letters to each other. And then I think were eventually able to be married. But we see a lot of references to the medieval past in this painting, not just in her dress, but of course in the stained glass windows behind her, even, the furniture, the style of the furniture that she is using to write. And the language speaks a thousand words, images convey a thousand words, as we look at the way that he's pulled her hand back from writing, sort of binding or constraining her in some ways in order to kiss her, and how his other hand is at her throat. It's very romanticized. Sort of an unusual pose here as well too. So another figure from medieval history that these pre-Raphaelite artists just loved was Joan of Arc, the famous French teenage girl who essentially led an army against the English and helped to win a few battles. She was called forward to do this by God, and she had visions of angels and that sort of thing. And she was like the perfect subject for the pre-Raphaelite artists, because it was an opportunity to paint a woman and to paint armor. And so we get a twofer with this particular image by John Everett Millais. And so she's kneeling, she looks penitent. A lot of the armor that we see in these paintings is just kind of like a mishmash of armor. It's not from a particular time period. I think most of these artists had just gone to like the Tower of London Museum and just saw, what was on display there, and then kind of extrapolated. So our leading artist of the pre-Raphaelite movement, Rossetti, he painted two different versions of Joan of Arc, and I feel like the differences between them are fascinating. One of them he painted over here on the left from 1863, and then on the right is from 1882. It was one of the last images he ever painted. He essentially finished it. It was on the easel, and then he just died at a pretty young age. So it's interesting to think about how his vision of young Joan of Arc changes. Both of these pictures obviously have her holding this massive sword and holding it against her face so that we see her profile sort of spotlit against that blade. In the earlier image, Joan of Arc looks really masculine to me. She has this very massive neck, this very well-defined jaw. I mean, if you didn't know it was Joan of Arc, I think you could easily mistake it for a man. And the kiss of the sword on the sword is very much like a spiritual kiss, because we see just beyond the sword is another representation of a crucifix and the feet of Jesus there. So she's about to go into battle, and it's a prayer. Over here on the right, somehow Joan of Arc has just become really sexy, right? She's a bombshell now, and she's got like long red hair, these clear blue eyes, this stunning profile, including, these big pouty lips and the swan-like neck. It's just, she's ravishing to behold. And then the flowers in the background would have been like the fleur-de-lis here. So we get a good sense in terms of kind of the evolution too, in terms of how these artists are even thinking about women. Even Eleanor Brickdale did her own Joan of Arc for her famous women book, and it's a completely different take on her. And I have to say, I love this one too. She's not a warrior. She's not wearing armor. She is still a peasant girl working on a farm, and our eyes go right to her head because of this red handkerchief and her bright red cheeks. We can just see a very subtle halo around her head, and it seems as like this is her moment of calling. She's kind of looking up and off to the side. And I love how this tree branch sort of comes down from above and almost seems to be like plucking her out of obscurity for this greater role that she was to have in history. All right, a few more historical figures that are very highly romanticized by our pre-Raphaelite artists. This is like as pre-Raphaelite as you can get. And this is a story that's called Fair Rosamond by John William Waterhouse. And the picture is actually painted in 1916, which is kind of mind-blowing. Like modernism is in full swing, and we still have pre-Raphaelite artists creating images like this. So Fair Rosamond was reputedly one of the greatest beauties of the 12th century. People wrote poems and ballads about her, and she was the mistress of King Henry II, who had a wife named Queen Eleanor. So according to sort of legend and maybe a little bit of history, he kept Fair Rosamond sort of sequestered away, and he had to go through this maze in order to find her. In different paintings, the maze looks like it's a complicated castle structure. Sometimes it looks like a garden maze, but he used red thread so that he could navigate that maze. And the story of Fair Rosamond is Queen Eleanor using the thread to find the woman who was, her husband's mistress, and she finds her and essentially forces her to commit suicide. She brings poison and a dagger, and she says, like, choose how you want to die. But you'll notice in this picture and in the next one I'm going to show you, Fair Rosamond looks like our heroine. Queen Eleanor looks like the villain. And that's because there was this notion of courtly love. People did not marry for love in medieval times. And so when people actually fell in love, it was a very romantic thing that you would sort of champion. This translates very well to the way the Pre-Raphaelite artists behaved in their own lives. There was this sense of, if I fall in love with my model, then I should be able to have an affair with her. Or if I fall in love with my colleague's wife, then why shouldn't we have a brief fling? So, so this notion of courtly love definitely resonated with the artists from the 1850s. We've got our pink flowers here for like the first blush of love, and we've got our sort of penitent looking Fair Rosamond. All right, and you'll notice too that her dress has those angel wing sleeves. Everything here is like meant to recall medieval history. Here's another version of Fair Rosamond by a female artist named Evelyn de Morgan. This one dates sometime after 1880, and we can see Queen Eleanor as a villain has been really emphasized here. She's got like flying monkeys around her. She's got these little dragons, and Fair Rosamond looks purely innocent, totally innocent. And she's even underneath the stained glass window here that's conveying a scene of love. We see the thread that has gotten her here. We see the poison. I'm not sure if I see the dagger offhand, but we know time is short for Fair Rosamond. We saw another Queen Eleanor a little bit earlier tonight. This is sort of a more sympathetic rendering of her with the poison, with the dagger. And then Dante Gabriel Rossetti actually painted his wife to look like Fair Rosamond, or in the guise of Fair Rosamond here. We can see she's got the thread, and you'll notice too that her hair is down and her dress looks sort of loose. All of these things are sort of suggestive of like a sort of a sexual looseness too. So it's interesting that he painted his wife that way. It certainly suggests a lot about their relationship. So the last historical figure I wanted to show you, another one of Eleanor Brookdale's famous women. This is a famous woman from Scottish medieval history, and she was Catherine Douglas, later called Kate Barlass, who helped with the prevention of the assassination of King James I of Scotland. So essentially, she's in this room with the king and a bunch of other people. They knew that there was a group coming to assassinate the king, and there's this famous statement of like, Kate, bar the door. And so, of course, there would have been like a board that was supposed to go through here to lock the door. And Kate was so committed to saving the king that she put her arm through instead of the board. Her arm was broken by the people breaking in, and I believe the king was later murdered. But we see all of this great medieval costuming and the detail of the tapestry and a little bit of the chaos in the room as she's trying to save her king. It's a great picture. It's a great story. All right, so let's switch gears now to literature. And we've already referenced a few of these great 19th century British poets who were very much an inspiration to our Pre-Raphaelite artists. And I'll try to move through these quickly because we are definitely short on time. These artists were interested in Dante as a medieval author. And so we can see this is a painting by Rossetti called Dante's Dream. He had this unrequited love with a woman named Beatrice. And in Dante's Dream, Beatrice has died and he's being led to sort of like her funeral pyre or her deathbed. And this angel's bringing her in. We've got all of these romanticized redheads here and all the poppies on the ground. So it's Dante provides the means for telling this romantic story set in medieval times. The next image I wanted to share with you, the next story is about Isabella, who was well, it's based on a poem from John Keats, but it's a story set in medieval times. And Isabella falls in love with a man named Lorenzo, who's below her station, and her brothers opposed to this romance. You can sort of get the sense that her brothers are kind of brutal jerks. He's even sort of kicking the dog in her lap. And in this picture by John Everett Millais, very early Pre-Raphaelite painting from 1849, we get the hint that something's going to happen related to this giant pot in the background because her brothers murder her lover, Lorenzo. She digs him up, cuts off his head, and buries it in a pot of basil and waters it with her tears. This is a very romanticized depiction of Isabella and the pot of basil from 1867 by William Holman Hunt. I wanted to share it with you. There's not a lot about this particular painting that's really medieval, but just to show you that these Pre-Raphaelite artists loved the story. Here's another depiction by John William Waterhouse from 1907, where Isabella is embracing this pot of basil as though it's her lover. We see the skull down here referencing Lorenzo's death and the fact that his head is in that pot. And then we've got our sole poppy right there referencing his death as well. Notice the angel wing sleeves, the medieval dress here. It's just like Fair Rosamond. In fact, this artist leaned very heavily on the same kind of dresses for almost all of his figures. So a few artists that dealt with Shakespeare as an inspiration for their artwork. Waterhouse certainly falls into that category, even though Shakespeare is a little bit after medieval times. I just wanted to show you how interested these artists were in literature, how it inspired their work. So this is Miranda from Shakespeare's The Tempest. It's another redhead in a beautiful dress like we've seen, but I love the landscape here, the water, the rocks. It's so well done. Ford Madox Brown's depiction of Romeo and Juliet, the balcony scene in Act 3. You know, is it the lark? Is it the nightingale? Is it morning? Is it day? And he's taking leave of Juliet, about to hop over that balcony. So romanticized, just lovely. And that is, of course, that same artist that we saw before who did The Last of England there. But this brings us to the ultimate Pre-Raphaelite painting, and that is the depiction of Ophelia from John Everett Millais. And this is, again, a very early Pre-Raphaelite painting. It's 1851, and this image is at the Tate. So Ophelia is the character from Hamlet. She was sort of like Hamlet's love interest. He kills her father, and then she essentially goes mad. And we know that she goes to the water and she's sort of singing to herself, and her dress gets wet, and then it sort of drags her into the water, and she essentially like drowns while she's in this, you know, state of sort of disassociation, having been so impacted by the death of her father. So Millais goes to this riverbank and he sits there for about 6 months, capturing all of the incredible detail that we see in this picture. This might remind you of that landscape that we had looked at to sort of start off tonight, to give us the sense of how interested these artists were in the natural world. But Millais focused on that landscape, and then he spent about 4 months with his artist. Again, this is Elizabeth Siddall, Dante Gabriel Rossetti's future wife, who's posing here. And she was actually in a bathtub in her dress, and they put like little heat lamps around it. At one point, the heat lamps went out and she got very sick, and her husband threatened to sue the artist for her medical bills. But we've got, all of this incredible detail. And of course, every single flower here has symbolic meaning. And there's so many of them. I'm sorry, I failed to commit them to memory, but I do have the details here in my notes. So the willow, the nettle, and the daisy are associated with forsaken love, pain, and innocence. The pansies, and we see a lot of them in the water, refer to love in vain. Violets, which we have a little chain of them around her neck, stand for faithfulness, chastity, or death of the young. So all of these things. Oh, and there's forget-me-nots in the water too. So I mean, all of these things are, carefully selected to help to reinforce the story of this character from literature. One of the details that I love about the creation of this work is that while he was working on this riverbank, Millet described the mosquitoes as being very muscular. So that gives you a sense in terms of the working conditions. So it sort of sounds like summer in New England. So one of the most famous paintings by far, and that brings us to legends, and we'll fly through the legends because we've seen so many of them tonight. But King Arthur for sure was the primary legend that these artists really resonated with, and it wasn't just Sir Thomas Malory's telling of King Arthur's legends from the 1400s. It was, again, 19th century British poets who were sort of using this as source material too. So this is an artist named James Archer's picture of the death of King Arthur. We see these lovely sort of pre-Raphaelite type women as King Arthur's lying here with like the animal skin over him. We can see the wounds in his chest. This would be Guinevere, and he is looking at this spirit, this angel type figure that is holding the grail above him. But the Arthurian legend, or sort of close to an Arthurian legend, that is so amazing when it comes to pre-Raphaelite painting is the Lady of Shalott. And there's a lot of paintings of her. The Lady of Shalott, very quickly, is the story of a woman who was cursed, and she had to sit in a tower and never look out her window, never actually look at the world around her, but she could look into a mirror that reflected the outside world. And she was, part of the curse is that she was kind of forced to weave this tapestry of the shadows that she saw in the outside world. Now, if she were to ever take her eyes up off of that or look out this window, then the curse kind of falls upon her. And in this picture, we see two images, both by John William Waterhouse, of the Lady of Shalott. In this moment, she's like just hearing people outside, and it's actually Sir Lancelot that distracts her, pulls her away ultimately. And we see her resting. It's like she's about to make this big decision. And of course, what we're seeing here is the reflection of the window that would be where we are as the viewers. We'll see a lot of round windows when we're looking at images of Lady of Shalott. Over here, the round mirrors. This is the round mirror behind her reflecting the window that she is now looking out. If you have really good eyes, this is Sir Lancelot's helmet and like a lance in his arms, and she is like all tangled up. They both are sort of tangled up in the threads from this tapestry. And you'll notice here too, over here on the right, that the mirror that had been reflecting the world for her now has this crack in it. But I think the most celebrated and perhaps the best known version of the Lady of Shalott is here in America, down at the Wadsworth Athenaeum. If you see this picture in person, it just knocks your socks off. This is William Holman Hunt's version of the story from 1905. It's amazing to think that they're still working in this style in 1905. So we see our knight over here, Sir Lancelot, reflected in this mirror, this round mirror that is reflecting a window that would be where we are. The curse is like kind of happening in this picture. And it's almost as though like gravity doesn't exist. Her hair is flying up in the air. Again, we see the crack in the mirror. She's like literally coming undone as these tapestries are coming undone. There's thread that's just like hanging here in the air. So, and then here's that detail of her face, this incredible bodice that she's wearing. And there's the knight reflected in the mirror in the background. So what happens to the Lady of Shalott? Well, she sort of meets a watery end. She takes this boat and she tries to get to Camelot, but it doesn't work out. She dies. And this is a painting of the Lady of Shalott sort of leaving the tower, getting on this boat, also by John William Waterhouse. This version is from 1888, and it's lovely, again, with all this detail of the natural world and the references to the medieval world sort of overlapping it. And I think he was kind of purposely thinking of another woman meeting a watery end. All right, so the last sort of legendary figures that I just wanted to throw in here very quickly are Tristan and Isolde, another kind of classic story of a love triangle. In this case, Tristan was sent to fetch Isolde to marry King Mark, and on the boat she gives him something to drink that is a love potion. Maybe she did it intentionally, maybe not, but they can't stay away from each other after that. So here he is romancing her, and King Mark is sort of like, hey, what's going on with these two? So it becomes this classic story, and the Pre-Raphaelite artists love to depict it again and again. Of course, this is Waterhouse on the left from 1916, and then over on the right, this is Edmund Leighton from 1902. But the medieval costuming, the suit of armor, this is all classic Pre-Raphaelite. So we'll end with our legacy tonight, and you'll see how these Pre-Raphaelite artists have touched your lives. So one of the big offshoots of Pre-Raphaelite paintings is credited with William Morris, who we see here in the portrait. Now he goes off to essentially have his own company where he's producing wallpaper and textiles and that sort of thing. And this is an example of the kind of work that he was creating. It was inspired by the Pre-Raphaelites' attention to nature, their fondness for nature, their weddedness to nature, but he sort of makes it a little bit more abstract. These are examples of his wallpapers from the 1870s and 80s. Lots of things that are identifiable here in terms of flower types. These are canthus leaves over here. These are some textiles that he created also from the 70s and 80s. And I have to say, I am a sucker for his patterns. I think they're absolutely gorgeous. And his work is very much connected to, inspired by, it drives an interest. Well, eventually it moves into Art Nouveau, which is a whole other conversation, but it also inspires the arts and crafts movement. So if you're sitting in your beautiful bungalow tonight, it's because of the Pre-Raphaelite artists. And because of William Morris in particular, he inspires this whole movement that values not just like medieval trades, but work that's made by hand. And this is kind of fighting encroaching industrialization too. So like the Gamble House in Pasadena by Green and Green, or like a Stickley desk over here, they have an aesthetic that's born out of this appreciation of the medieval past. So one other great connection, and this is like a preview for next month when we talk about Wyeth, if you're familiar with N.C. Wyeth's depictions or illustrations of storybooks, then King Arthur, his Robin Hood pictures, these were all very much inspired by Pre-Raphaelite artists because N.C. Wyeth's teacher essentially collected those images. So N.C. Wyeth was steeped in Pre-Raphaelite imagery. If we go back to England for a moment, most of these Pre-Raphaelite paintings, a lot of them, are at one particular museum called the Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery. And that's a place where Tolkien hung out. So a lot of these paintings inspired Tolkien's stories. Here's a cover, which obviously Tolkien didn't design, but you could almost imagine Ophelia kind of floating by here. And Tolkien inspired musicians like Led Zeppelin. And so we're looking at, this like 60s, 70s rock band who named their songs after aspects of Tolkien's writing. And Jimmy Page, the guitarist, actually collected Pre-Raphaelite artwork. This is him hanging out playing pool in his house, and you'll notice the tapestry behind him is this huge Edward Burne-Jones tapestry that he now lends to major British museums every now and then. So what does this all have to do with today? Well, look at what people were wearing at Woodstock. Look at the clothes, the chain of flowers, the angel wing sleeves. This all goes back to Pre-Raphaelite fashion as well. It's amazing to think that our modern conception of hippie is so much inspired by these, revolutionary 20-something-year-old British artists. And today there's like a comeback of it. There's people who are just like really, really fanatical about William Morris's prints. They get tattoos. I really love his designs, but the most I can commit is with like a wall calendar. Architectural Digest even credited William Morris with being the forefather to this style in interior decorating today that's called Grand Millennial, that young millennials decorate their houses like this to look like their grandmother's house. And then we'll wrap up today with our last big legacy. And that is that we have scholars today who are looking back at the Pre-Raphaelites, and they're exploring more of how women contributed to this movement, not just as muses, but as artists in their own right. And so it's really exciting that books like this are getting published and getting some attention. So I'm sure in like the next, few years to come, we'll have another talk that will just focus on like Elizabeth Siddell. So, so that was a lot of information and a little over time, but I'll end there for now. And I welcome any questions or comments anybody has about the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. I'll start looking through the chat as well.
Yeah, we had one question from oh yeah, I thought about this too. Why is it that they chose for many of their heroines to have red hair?
Red hair. It really grabs your attention. It's very visually striking, right?
Yeah.
It's, I think, for like the same reason that Norman Rockwell loved a redhead. And the Pre-Raphaelites, like that original group, they would basically like troll the streets looking for women to paint. And so they had a particular type for sure. And it was essentially considered like an unconventional beauty. A lot of the women that we look at in these pictures that I think, any one of us would say, oh, that's a beautiful woman. At the time, there was something a little bit maybe garish about them.
Mhm.
I know even like a few decades later in France, so I'm not sure if it's true in England at this time, but women who dyed their hair red were oftentimes like performers or courtesans. So I sort of get the sense that they were like women who were maybe living on the edge, but they
Right.
became influencers in their own right because they became famous for being in these paintings. Yeah.
Yeah, it certainly is beautiful.
Yeah. Oh God, yes.
Did Japanese influence Pre-Raphaelites?
Not that I know of. I haven't seen anything to that effect, and I think like the trade routes where it's like all of a sudden Japanese imagery sort of flooded Europe, I think it sort of happens a little bit after the fact. I think of that as like the early 1860s. I could be wrong on that. But I think in this case, they're pretty focused on the medieval past for the most part. But that's an interesting idea. I might have to go back and double check on that one.
So one of my favorite movements in literature is Romanticism, and Mary Wollstonecraft's novel Frankenstein is one of my favorites, and she's part of a movement with Percy Shelley and how does that correspond? Like, do the literary movement correspond to does the literary movement correspond to the artistic movement in any way? Because I think she published it in 1818. So
yeah, it's interesting that they were sort of reaching back to at least poets that were, several decades, poetry that was several decades older.
Classics.
Yeah.
Like classical antiquity, I think. But also like, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, Keats, I think Keats was a contemporary, and he wrote that Ode on the Grecian Urn, which everyone has to read.
Right.
And that is kind of like harkening back to antiquity. So I don't know. Yeah. Not to confuse things.
No, you're right on the money, Jess. It's essentially they're looking at like Keats and Tennyson, who were writing about classical antiquity, but also about the medieval past, like as interpreted by like Sir Mallory's, Arthurian legends a lot of the time. So,
Yes.
I mean, it is like a mishmash of historical influences in a lot of ways. I could have easily done a pre-Raphaelite program that was just looking at classical influences as well.
Mhm.
So, but I think there's so many suits of armor. There's so many
Yeah.
women in these like angel wing sleeve dresses that it's sort of an easy fit. But you bring up a really good point, and I don't like I didn't come across a lot of instances of them looking at novels from the 19th century. I mean, they're painting pictures of Shakespeare, you know. So I mean, they were really looking backwards. And it's so interesting to think of a revolutionary movement where they're simply looking at, you know, source material from the past.
Yeah, it is, but it isn't really. I mean, if you think about, like you referenced, the 1960s, there was a whole, or Ezra Pound was looking at the cantos
Right,
of
right.
Dante, and so, and kind of recreating that. And there's a whole modernist movement where they were looking back at the classics. So,
That's
I
true.
mean,
That's true. Yeah.
it's not unprecedented, but it's so interesting. I love that stuff.
I should note
Um,
too that like the hippies from the 60s who were dressing like pre-Raphaelite models, I mean, part of that too is like the free love that was happening with the pre-Raphaelites and the
right.
courtly love that was happening with in the medieval stories. I mean, it's such an interesting line to connect through all of them.
So
Um,
interesting.
Karen
I
asks about William Morris's wife, Jane. Yes, she was one of Rossetti's muses. And is she Joan of Arc on the slide on the right? That offhand, I'm not sure of. Let me see if I put that in my notes. That's a good question. She might have been in Dante's Dream. I was so tempted to get into, who slept with who. But at a certain point, I was like, okay, we're getting too far away from the paintings themselves, right? I don't think I have in my notes if that was her, but it definitely looks like her. She's got the very striking, I mean, the most striking red hair there, right? So that's a good question. And I'm sure that's an easy thing to look up. But that's a great question, Karen.
I love how the women look so much more, I don't know, like more of our modern day version of a model than in the Raphaelite era. Like they're kind of more fleshy,
Yeah.
but
Oh, yeah.
now, but in the pre-Raphaelite, they look much slimmer.
Yeah, one of the things that I sort of get fascinated by is like how they kind of dominate the canvas so often too, especially with like Rossetti and like Joan of Arc. I
Yeah.
mean, she's taking up the entire thing. She's like a big,
Mhm.
impressive figure. It is interesting to think about how like our notions of beauty have and haven't changed. Emma, I saw your question about paintings in local galleries or the greater Boston area. I think there might be some paintings by Edmund Leighton at the MFA, but it's really Hartford. It's at the Wadsworth where you can see that Lady of Shalott painting where it's like the curse is coming down and she's like practically floating in that picture. It's such a knockout. But most of these are still in British collections, not surprisingly. A lot of them are at the Tate and a lot of them are at that Birmingham Museum too, which is a shame, but I mean, it just means that we all have to go travel and see them.
Did Southeast Asia, Africa, and Middle East art influence this art?
It's a really good question. I didn't come across that in my research, but I was really looking for very specific information that tied things back to medieval sources. So that's not to say that it didn't, but I guess I didn't stumble upon that in my research for tonight. It's a really good question. That feels like it could be its own presentation in and of itself, because that would be a lot of really good source material. I'd be interested to know if you saw something tonight that really reminded you of artwork from those regions too.
Oh yeah, there was the Dutch really started traveling in the 15th century. And that might be really interesting. Awesome. Thank you. We'll have to make a trip down to Hartford. Thank you so much for another wonderful presentation.
When you go to Hartford, everyone, if you've never been to the Wadsworth, I have to tell you right now, it's one of the best museums I've ever been to. And also, I don't know if it's open right now. I imagine it is, but also go to the Mark Twain House that's in Hartford. It's unforgettable. Both of those places, they deserve like their own full days. So have a great time in Hartford, Connecticut.
Prachi wanted to know, in the art where the brothers are
Oh,
pushing the
interesting.
dog, the
Yeah.
family has Turkish features.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so when I was researching on that one, let's see, that was this one. Like I almost didn't include this image because most of the scholarship sort of talks about how this is more like an early Renaissance painting, in that we see all of these figures in profile. That was like the real sort of early Renaissance motif. So it's interesting that you see the features that sort of connect to a different culture, but like my initial reading was on early Renaissance. And now I'm like wondering, I'm like, oh, maybe the pattern in the background, maybe, I don't know. It could certainly be an influence. Yeah, that it's a great thing to point out. And oh, I'm also noticing down here, one aspect of pre-Raphaelitism that I didn't talk about was that this was like a secret society when they first started, and they would actually put PRB, those initials, Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, into their pictures because you can't be in a secret society and not tell people about it. But that was just part of like that first initial group of really young men who wanted to make a splash. So that's actually one of the few times where I've noticed the PRB sticking out like that. So another sort of fun little detail to be searching for, but that's a good question and a good connection in this case. So thank you.
I would love to know how many movements name themselves before rather than after.
Right.
I feel like
Yeah.
it happens mostly after, but that's cool. They anticipated it.
They really wanted to make a name for themselves.
I think that's all the questions we have tonight, Jane. And I want to thank you so much for coming online with us. And thank you everyone for attending tonight. It was a really great attendance, and the recording will go out to everyone after sometime tomorrow, probably. But thank you so much.
Always a pleasure.
And
thank you so much, everybody.
don't forget to attend the next one on the Wyeths. That one's going to be really good too. Family of Artists. And that's on Monday, October 25th, 2021 at 7 p.m. And you can register on our calendar. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming.
Thanks, everyone. Take care. Good night.
Bye.